bear. Family throws. Baby shower before birth. They prepared for his arrival. The morning mist hung low between the ancient pines, creating ghostly curtains that shifted with each breath of wind. Ethan Marshall pressed his back against the rough bark of an oak tree, his camera lens fogged from the humidity, his hands trembling not from cold, but from what he was witnessing. He had come to these remote woods seeking solitude, seeking the predictable rhythms of nature that had always calmed his restless mind after his wife's passing 2 years ago. But what unfolded before him in that small clearing challenged everything he thought he knew about the wild world. The first bear had appeared just after dawn, a massive male with fur the color of dark honey, moving through the underbrush with a grace that seemed almost deliberate, almost careful. Ethan had photographed hundreds of bears over his 20-year career, had watched them fish for salmon, had observed mothers teaching cubs to climb, had documented their fierce territorial battles. But this bear moved differently. It carried something in its mouth, not prey, not food, but a collection of bright green moss still glistening with morning dew. The bear placed the moss carefully, so carefully, at the entrance of a den hidden beneath the twisted roots of a fallen cedar. Then it sat back on its haunches and studied its work, tilting its massive head as if considering whether the placement was just right. Ethan lowered his camera slowly, afraid that even the softest click of the shutter might break whatever spell had fallen over this place. His breath came in shallow whispers as he watched the bear adjust the moss, pushing it slightly to the left with one enormous paw. The creature's movements held a tenderness that made Ethan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. This wasn't the mechanical instinct of nest building he had observed in birds or the simple den preparation he had seen in other mammals. This was something else entirely, something that whispered of intention, of care, of preparation that went beyond mere survival. A second bear emerged from the forest's depths, smaller than the first, her coat a rich cinnamon that caught the filtered sunlight. She moved with obvious difficulty, her belly swollen and low, each step measured and slow. The male bear rose immediately at her approach, and what happened next made Ethan forget to breathe entirely. The male touched his nose gently to hers, a greeting so soft it barely disturbed the air between them, then led her slowly to the den entrance. She paused there, examining the moss he had placed, and made a low sound in her throat that Ethan had never heard from a bear before. It wasn't a growl or a huff, but something almost musical. A rumbling approval that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. The female bear settled herself near the den, but not inside it, lying on her side in a patch of sunlight that had broken through the canopy. The male disappeared into the forest again, leaving Ethan alone with his racing thoughts and the pregnant bear, who seemed to doze in the morning warmth. He should leave, he knew. Every rule of wildlife observation told him to maintain distance, to avoid interfering, to document without engaging. But something held him there, some invisible thread that connected him to this scene, to this moment that felt heavy with significance he couldn't yet understand. 20 minutes passed before the male returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Following behind him came another bear, elderly by the white around its muzzle, moving with the careful dignity of age. This bear also carried something, a collection of smooth river stones that clicked together softly as it walked. The pregnant female raised her head at their approach, but didn't rise, simply watched as the two males began arranging the stones around the den entrance. They worked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, a shared understanding that needed no words. The stones formed a pattern that Ethan couldn't quite make out from his position, but he could see the care in their placement, the way each bear would step back to examine the growing design before adding another stone. As the sun climbed higher, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow, more bears arrived. A younger female with 2 cubs of her own, who immediately began helping with the strange decoration, their small paws carrying single leaves with such concentration that Ethan found himself smiling despite his confusion. An adolescent male who brought branches of pine, still fresh and fragrant, laying them in careful lines that radiated out from the den like rays of the sun. Each bear that arrived seemed to know exactly what was needed, exactly where their contribution should go, as if following some blueprint invisible to human eyes. Ethan's legs had long since gone numb from crouching in the same position, but he dared not move. His camera hung forgotten around his neck as he watched this impossible gathering, this deliberate and gentle preparation that defied every scientific paper he had ever read about Ursine behavior. Bears were solitary creatures, coming together only to mate or when forced to share abundant food sources. They didn't have family reunions. They didn't help each other prepare dens. They certainly didn't decorate with the careful attention of artists creating a masterpiece. By midday, the area around the den had been transformed. The moss formed a soft green carpet at the entrance. The stones created spiraling patterns that seemed to flow like water frozen in time. The pine branches released their sharp, clean scent into the air, and scattered throughout were flowers. Actual wildflowers, their purple and yellow petals bright against the earth. The pregnant female had risen at some point, and now stood in the center of this creation, turning slowly to take it all in. The other bears sat in a loose circle around her, their dark eyes watchful and patient. It was then that Ethan noticed something that made his scientific mind reel even further. The pattern of the stones, the placement of the branches, the scattered flowers, they weren't random at all. From his elevated position against the oak tree, he could see what the bears perhaps couldn't from ground level. The decorations formed a map of sorts, or maybe a picture, though of what he couldn't quite determine. It reminded him of something that danced at the edge of his memory but refused to come into focus. The female bear made that musical sound again, louder this time, and all the other bears responded with similar tones, creating a harmony that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Then, one by one, they began to leave. Not abruptly, not in the way animals scatter when threatened, but slowly, deliberately, each one pausing to touch noses with the pregnant female before disappearing back into the forest. Soon, only the original male remained, sitting beside her as she settled once more near the decorated den. Ethan watched them through the afternoon, these 2 bears who had shattered his understanding of the natural world. The male would occasionally rise to adjust a stone that had shifted, or to add a fresh flower to replace one that had wilted. The female dozed intermittently, her breathing deep and steady, occasionally making soft sounds that the male would answer with gentle huffs of his own. It was domestic in a way that animal behavior wasn't supposed to be, tender in a way that challenged the very foundation of what Ethan thought he knew about wildlife. As evening approached and the forest began its transition into night, painting everything in shades of purple and deep blue, Ethan finally forced himself to move. His joints protested, his muscles cramped, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His mind was too full of what he had witnessed, too overwhelmed by questions that had no answers. He backed away slowly, carefully, not wanting to disturb the peace of the scene. The 2 bears remained where they were, silhouettes now against the fading light, guardians of their decorated den and whatever miracle was preparing to unfold within it. That night, Ethan sat in his small cabin 5 miles from the clearing, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. How could he write about this? How could he explain to his editor, to the scientific community, to anyone, what he had seen? Bears preparing for a birth like humans, preparing a nursery, working together with purpose and artistic vision, creating something beautiful simply for the sake of beauty itself. They would think he had lost his mind, that grief had finally broken something inside him. Maybe it had. Maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see, projecting human emotions onto animal behavior because he so desperately missed the human connections he had lost. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see the careful way that male bear had placed the moss, the gentle greeting between the mates, the community of bears working together with such deliberate care. He could still hear that musical communication, unlike any bear vocalization in any field guide or research paper. No, what he had witnessed was real as the ache in his chest when he thought about his wife, as real as the wonder that had replaced his grief, if only for a few hours. He returned the next morning before dawn, moving through the forest by memory and instinct more than sight. The clearing was quiet when he arrived, but the decorations remained, somehow more beautiful in the pre-dawn darkness. The stones seemed to glow faintly in the starlight, and now, with the different angle and lighting, Ethan could see more clearly what they represented. His breath caught in his throat as recognition flooded through him. The pattern wasn't random at all. It was a star map. Specifically the constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear, laid out in perfect proportion with smaller stones representing dimmer stars and larger ones for the constellation's brightest points. The male bear was awake, sitting beside the den entrance, his massive form a dark shadow against the decorated ground. The female was inside the den now. Ethan could hear her breathing. Different from yesterday, faster, with occasional pauses that made his heart skip. The male's attention never wavered from the den entrance, his entire being focused on whatever was happening within. Ethan settled into his watching position, his camera finally ready, though he wondered if any photograph could capture the magnitude of what he was witnessing. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the canopy, illuminating the clearing in stages like a slowly opening curtain, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Birds that should have been singing their dawn chorus remained silent. The ever-present rustle of small creatures in the underbrush stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving the leaves motionless, as if nature itself was waiting, watching, anticipating. The female's breathing changed again, becoming rhythmic in a way that Ethan recognized from documentary footage he had seen of animal births. But this felt different, more momentous somehow, as if the universe itself was paying attention. The male bear rose to his feet, began pacing in a small circle, his movements betraying an anxiety that was startlingly human. He would pause at the den entrance, listen intently, then resume his pacing, occasionally making low sounds that seemed meant to comfort or encourage. Then, from deep within the den, came a sound that Ethan had never heard before and would never forget. It wasn't the squeal of a newborn cub, not exactly. It was more musical than that, almost like a single, perfect note being played on an instrument he couldn't name. The male bear froze, his entire body rigid with attention, and then, slowly, so slowly, he lowered himself to his belly and crawled partially into the den. What emerged moments later made Ethan's hands shake so badly he couldn't hold his camera steady. The male bear backed out of the den, and cradled impossibly gently in his massive jaws was a cub, but not like any cub Ethan had ever seen. This tiny creature seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. Its fur, not the dark brown or black of a normal newborn bear, but a soft silver that caught and reflected the sunlight like moonlight on water. The male placed the cub carefully on the moss bed at the den entrance, and the baby made that musical sound again, stronger this time, a note that seemed to resonate in Ethan's chest. The female emerged slowly from the den, her movements exhausted but purposeful. She immediately went to her cub, began the normal process of cleaning and warming, but even these mundane maternal actions seemed elevated somehow, ritualistic in their careful execution. The cub responded to her attention with more of those musical sounds, creating a simple melody that made Ethan think absurdly of lullabies, of the songs his wife used to hum while gardening, of beauty that existed simply because it could. As if summoned by the cub's song, the other bears began to return. They emerged from the forest like shadows becoming solid, moving with silent purpose toward the clearing. The elderly bear from yesterday came first, followed by the mother with her cubs, then the adolescent, then others Ethan hadn't seen before. Soon there were a dozen bears arranged in that same loose circle, all watching the silver cub with expressions that Ethan could only describe as reverent. The sun had fully risen now, its light streaming through the canopy in defined beams that seemed to spotlight the decorated den and its miraculous occupant. The cub, eyes still closed, began to move, not with the blind, stumbling movements of a typical newborn, but with something approaching grace. It found its mother's warmth, settled against her, and the musical sound softened to something like a purr, if purrs could carry melody. One by one, the watching bears approached. Each one brought something: a fresh flower, a particularly beautiful stone, a feather that must have taken incredible care for a bear to carry without destroying. They placed these offerings around the cub and its mother, adding to the decoration that had been started the day before. The pattern grew more complex, more beautiful, and Ethan realized with a start that it was expanding the star map, adding the surrounding constellations, creating a mirror of the night sky on the forest floor. The elderly bear approached last. Moving with careful dignity despite its obvious age, it lowered its great head to the cub, breathed gently on the tiny form, and made a sound that was different from any bear vocalization Ethan knew, almost like words, though in no language he could understand. The cub responded with a single, clear note that rang through the clearing like a bell, and every bear, including the parents, lowered their heads in what looked impossibly like a bow. Ethan's vision blurred with tears he hadn't realized were falling. He thought of his wife, of the children they had never had the chance to have, of all the mysteries in the world that science couldn't explain. Here was one of those mysteries, playing out before him in a tableau that felt both ancient and immediate, both impossible and absolutely true. He raised his camera with trembling hands, not sure if he would ever share these images with another soul, but needing to capture them nonetheless, if only to prove to himself later that this had been real. As the day progressed, the gathering took on the quality of a celebration, though unlike any Ethan could have imagined. The bears didn't play or feast as animals might at a gathering. Instead, they seemed to simply exist together in peaceful companionship, occasionally adjusting the decorations, sometimes making those musical sounds that the cub would answer, creating harmonies that made the air itself seem to shimmer. The young cubs were remarkably gentle, approaching the newborn with careful curiosity, but never touching, as if they understood the preciousness of this new life. By afternoon, Ethan noticed something else extraordinary. Other animals had begun to gather at the edges of the clearing. A family of deer stood perfectly still just within the tree line, their large eyes fixed on the silver cub. Squirrels sat motionless on branches, their usual chatter silenced. Even a fox, natural prey for a gathering of bears, sat boldly in plain view, its attention entirely on the scene at the decorated den. It was as if the entire forest had come to witness this birth, this arrival of something special into their world. The silver cub had opened its eyes by then, revealing irises that weren't the typical brown of bear cubs, but a deep blue, like the sky just after sunset. It looked around at its decorated nursery, at the gathering of bears, at the watching forest, with what seemed like awareness far beyond what an hours-old creature should possess. When its gaze somehow found Ethan hidden in his watching place, he felt a jolt of connection so powerful it took his breath away. The cub held his gaze for a long moment, and in that moment, Ethan felt seen in a way he hadn't felt since his wife's death. Understood in a way that transcended species and logic. As evening approached once again, painting the forest in warm golds and deep shadows, the gathered bears began to disperse. But their leaving was different from yesterday's departure. Each bear, before going, would add one final touch to the ground decoration, completing portions of the star map that Ethan could now see clearly depicted not just Ursa Major and its surrounding constellations, but the entire visible night sky of this particular place and season. It was a work of art that should have been impossible for creatures without human intelligence to create. Yet, here it was, made with stones and flowers and arranged earth, beautiful and precise and absolutely intentional. The mother bear had settled into the den with her cub as the last of the visitors departed, leaving only the father standing guard. But even his posture was different from a typical guard stance. He sat facing outward, yes, but his position allowed him to also see the star map spread before him, and occasionally he would look down at it, then up at the darkening sky, where the real stars were beginning to appear, as if comparing the two, as if ensuring the accuracy of what had been created. Ethan waited until full darkness had settled over the forest before he began his careful retreat. As he moved through the trees, guided by moonlight and memory, he could hear the silver cub's musical sounds drifting through the night air, a lullaby that seemed to harmonize with the whisper of wind in the leaves, with the distant call of an owl, with the very heartbeat of the forest itself. He thought about the star map laid out in stones and flowers, about the gathering of bears that defied everything he knew about animal behavior, about the silver cub whose very existence seemed to bridge the gap between the possible and the impossible. Back in his cabin, Ethan sat in darkness, not bothering to light a lamp. Through his window, he could see the constellation of Ursa Major rising in the night sky, and he thought about the map on the forest floor, about the bears who had somehow known to create it, about the silver cub born under its pattern. He thought about his wife, who had always believed there was more magic in the world than science could explain, who had told him once that grief was just love with nowhere to go. Maybe she had been right. Maybe what he had witnessed wasn't about science at all, but about something deeper, something that connected all living things in ways that couldn't be measured or studied or understood through observation alone. He pulled out his laptop, its screen bright in the darkness, and began to write. Not a scientific report, not an article for a nature magazine, but simply the story of what he had seen. He wrote about the bears and their impossible gentleness, about the decorations that mirrored the stars, about the silver cub whose birth had brought together an entire forest in peaceful witness. He wrote about mystery and wonder and the possibility that some things were meant to be experienced rather than explained. As he typed, he could still hear, faint on the night wind, the musical sounds of the silver cub, and he smiled for the first time in 2 years. Tomorrow he would return to the clearing. He would continue to watch, to document this impossible family and their silver child. He wouldn't try to explain it, wouldn't reduce it to data and behavior patterns. He would simply be present for whatever unfolded, a witness to a mystery that had chosen to reveal itself to him. The star map on the forest floor had been perfect, he realized, each constellation in its proper place, each star represented with appropriate brightness. How had the bears known? How had they managed such precision with only stones and flowers? The questions multiplied in his mind, but for once he was content not to have answers. Some things, his wife would have said, were more beautiful for their mystery. The silver cub, the decorated den, the gathering of bears, all of it existed in a space between what should be possible and what clearly was, and maybe that space, that liminal territory between known and unknown, was where the real magic lived. Through his window, Ursa Major continued its eternal path across the night sky, and somewhere in the forest below, its earthly reflection surrounded a den where a silver cub slept, protected by decorations that spoke of love and community and connections that transcended species. Ethan saved his document, closed his laptop, and went to bed, falling asleep to the memory of musical notes drifting through the forest, a lullaby for all who had ears to hear and hearts open enough to believe in the impossible. The next morning arrived with a gentle rain that turned the forest into a cathedral of dripping green. Ethan made his way back to the clearing, his rain jacket rustling softly with each movement. He expected to find the decorations washed away, the stones scattered, the flowers wilted and destroyed. But when he reached his observation spot, he gasped at what he saw. The rain had not destroyed the star map, but had somehow enhanced it. The stones glistened like actual stars. The flowers had opened wider to catch the moisture, and the entire pattern seemed to pulse with life. The silver cub was outside the den despite the rain, sitting on the moss bed while its mother groomed it with infinite patience. The water seemed to bead differently on the cub's silver fur, creating tiny prisms that caught what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. The cub was making its musical sounds again, but they were different in the rain, more complex, as if it was harmonizing with the rhythm of the droplets on leaves, creating a symphony from the weather itself. The father bear sat nearby, and Ethan noticed he had added to the decorations during the night. New patterns had emerged, created with twigs and leaves arranged in spirals that reminded Ethan of galaxies, of the vast cosmic swirls that contained billions of stars. The bear would occasionally adjust these new additions, moving a twig slightly, replacing a leaf that had blown out of position, maintaining the integrity of the design with an attention to detail that spoke of purpose beyond instinct. As the rain softened to a mist, other forest creatures began to appear again. But their behavior was even stranger than yesterday. A rabbit hopped directly through the clearing, passing within feet of the bears without showing any fear. Birds landed on the decorated ground, adding their own small contributions of seeds and berries to the pattern. A butterfly, impossible this late in the season, landed directly on the silver cub's nose, its wings opening and closing slowly as the cub watched with those impossible blue eyes. The mother bear made a low sound, and the father responded by disappearing into the forest. He returned minutes later carrying something that made Ethan's rational mind simply give up trying to make sense of things. It was a piece of quartz crystal, clear and multifaceted, far too large for a bear to have found easily or carried comfortably. The father placed it at the center of the star map, right where Polaris would be, and when a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds and hit the crystal, it scattered rainbow light across the entire decoration, turning the forest floor into a canvas of color. The silver cub stood for the first time, its movements already more coordinated than should be possible for a day-old creature. It walked slowly but steadily to the crystal, and placed one tiny paw on its surface. The musical sound it made then was different, deeper, more resonant, and the crystal seemed to vibrate in response, adding its own pure tone to the cub's voice. The harmony created made the air itself seem to sing, and every creature in the clearing, from the massive parent bears to the tiniest watching bird, fell completely silent, as if listening to something profound. Ethan found himself holding his breath, his camera forgotten, his scientific mind completely surrendered to the wonder of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior anymore. This was something else entirely, something that suggested intelligence and purpose beyond what any wildlife biologist would accept. The bears weren't just caring for a cub. They were celebrating something cosmic, something that connected the earth to the stars in ways that humans had forgotten how to see. As the day progressed, the clearing became a place of pilgrimage. Animals that had never been seen together peacefully shared the space. Predator and prey stood side by side, their usual relationships suspended in the presence of the silver cub. A hawk perched next to a mouse. A wolf lay down near the deer family. All of them watched the cub with the same expression of wonder that Ethan felt in his own heart. The cub explored its decorated nursery with careful steps, examining each element of the star map as if reading a story written in stones and flowers. Sometimes it would pause at a particular arrangement and make its musical sounds, and the parents would respond with their own vocalizations, creating conversations that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. The other creatures would listen to these exchanges with rapt attention, as if understanding something Ethan could not. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped completely, and the sun emerged to transform the wet forest into a glittering wonderland. The star map sparkled with moisture, each stone and flower catching the light. The crystal at its center threw rainbows in every direction, painting the surrounding trees with color. And at the heart of it all, the silver cub sat beside its mother, its fur now dry and shimmering like liquid starlight. It was then that the elderly bear from the first day returned, moving slowly through the gathered animals who parted respectfully to let it pass. The old bear approached the cub and, with great effort, lowered itself to the ground until it was eye level with the tiny creature. What happened next made Ethan question everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between species, between possible and impossible, between earth and sky. The elderly bear began to make sounds, not the typical vocalizations of a bear, but something more complex, more structured, almost like language. The silver cub listened intently, its blue eyes never leaving the old bear's face. Then the cub responded, its musical voice taking on the same structured quality, as if they were having an actual conversation. The other bears and animals watched in perfect stillness, witnesses to something that felt ancient and sacred. The conversation, if that's what it was, continued for several minutes. Sometimes the elderly bear would gesture with its paw toward the star map, toward the sky, toward the forest around them. The cub would follow these gestures, occasionally making sounds that seemed like questions, which the old bear would answer with patient elaboration. It was teaching, Ethan realized with a shock. The elderly bear was teaching the cub something, passing on knowledge that bears shouldn't have, couldn't have, yet clearly did. As the sun began to set, painting the clearing in warm golden light, the elderly bear finally stood. It touched its nose gently to the cub's head, a blessing or a farewell, then began to walk away. But its movement was different now, labored in a way it hadn't been before, as if the conversation had taken everything it had left to give. The other bears watched it go with something like reverence, and the silver cub made a single, long, mournful note that followed the old bear into the forest. The gathering began to disperse as darkness approached, but not before each animal added something to the star map. Even the predators, the wolf and the hawk, found ways to contribute, dropping feathers or fur that became part of the growing pattern. By the time the last visitor had gone, the decoration had evolved into something even more elaborate, not just a map of the stars, but a representation of the entire cosmos, with spirals suggesting galaxies, clusters indicating nebulae, and paths between them that looked like the theoretical routes of cosmic travelers. Ethan remained in his hiding spot long after dark, watching as the real stars emerged overhead. The constellation of Ursa Major was directly above the clearing now, and he could see how perfectly the ground map aligned with it. But more than that, he could see other constellations represented in the decoration. Some he recognized, others that seemed to be patterns he had never noticed before in the night sky. It was as if the bears had access to a different understanding of the heavens, one that included connections and patterns invisible to human astronomy. The silver cub was nursing now, making soft musical sounds that harmonized with the night sounds of the forest. Its father sat guard, but his attention was split between watching for danger and studying the star map, as if memorizing every detail. Occasionally, he would look up at the actual stars, then back at the map, and make small adjustments to maintain the accuracy of the representation. As Ethan finally prepared to leave, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the peace of the night, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. The silver cub had stopped nursing and was sitting up, looking directly at the stars overhead. It began to make its musical sounds, but they were different now, more complex, more purposeful. It was singing, Ethan realized, actually singing to the stars. And impossibly, wonderfully, terrifyingly, something seemed to be singing back. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a vibration that Ethan felt in his bones, a harmony that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The stars themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the cub's song, growing brighter and dimmer in patterns that matched the melody. The decorated ground began to glow faintly, the stones phosphorescing with their own light, the pattern becoming luminous in the darkness. The parent bears showed no alarm at this impossible phenomenon. They simply watched their cub commune with the cosmos as if this was expected, as if this was why they had prepared so carefully, why they had created the star map, why the entire forest had come to witness this birth. The silver cub was not just a bear, Ethan understood with a clarity that bypassed his rational mind entirely. It was something more, something that belonged to both earth and sky, a bridge between the mundane and the miraculous. The singing continued for perhaps 10 minutes, though time seemed to stretch and compress strangely during the performance. When it finally ended, the cub curled up against its mother and fell asleep, looking like any ordinary bear cub except for its impossible silver fur and the faint glow that still emanated from its small form. The stars returned to their normal brightness. The ground stopped glowing, and the forest resumed its typical night sounds as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Ethan knew better. He had witnessed something that would change him forever, something that made all his years of scientific study seem like a child's first fumbling attempts to understand the world. There were mysteries here that science couldn't touch, connections that transcended physical laws, intelligence that existed in forms humanity had never imagined. The silver cub was proof that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone suspected. He made his way back to his cabin in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he had experienced. The rational part of him, the part trained in scientific method and empirical observation, wanted to find explanations, to reduce what he had seen to something comprehensible. But the deeper part of him, the part that had been awakened by grief and wonder, knew that some things weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be experienced, to be felt, to be accepted as gifts from a universe that was far more alive and aware than humans had ever dreamed. That night, Ethan dreamed of stars that sang and bears that knew the secrets of the cosmos. He dreamed of his wife, who smiled at him and said nothing, just pointed to the sky where new constellations were forming. Patterns that spelled out messages of love and loss and the eternal connections between all living things. He woke with tears on his face and a certainty in his heart that he had been chosen to witness something sacred, something that would sustain him through whatever darkness lay ahead. The following days blended into a rhythm of observation and wonder. Each morning, Ethan would return to the clearing to find new additions to the star map, new patterns that revealed depths of knowledge that should have been impossible for any earthly creature to possess. The silver cub grew with unusual speed, but its growth was measured not just in size, but in the increasing complexity of its songs, in the deepening connection it seemed to have with the cosmos above and the earth below. Other bears continued to visit, bringing offerings and additions to the ever-growing decoration. But now Ethan noticed that some of them had unusual markings of their own, subtle patterns in their fur that resembled constellations, as if they too carried star maps on their bodies. He began to wonder if the silver cub was not unique, but part of something larger, an ancient lineage of cosmic bears that had existed alongside ordinary bears for millennia, hidden from human observation until now. On the 7th day after the birth, something extraordinary happened. The elderly bear that had taught the cub returned, but it was clearly dying. It moved with enormous effort, each step a struggle against the failing of its body. The other bears made way for it, their heads lowered in what could only be described as respect. The silver cub, now the size of a small dog despite being only a week old, went to meet the old bear, and they touched noses in a greeting that seemed to carry the weight of generations. The elderly bear lay down in the center of the star map, right beside the crystal that marked Polaris. It was breathing heavily, its eyes growing dim, but it seemed peaceful, even content. The silver cub sat beside it and began to sing, not the playful musical sounds of before, but something deeper, more profound. A song that seemed to acknowledge the approaching transformation from life to whatever came after. As the old bear's breathing slowed, other animals began to gather again. They formed concentric circles around the dying bear and the silver cub, predator and prey united in witness to this passage. The parent bears sat close by, their massive heads bowed, their usual vigilance set aside for this moment of transition. Even the birds fell silent, and the wind stilled, as if the forest itself was holding vigil. The silver cub's song grew more complex, harmonies layering upon harmonies, creating music that seemed to pull the very stars closer to Earth. And then, as the elderly bear took its last breath, something miraculous occurred. Its body began to glow with the same soft light that sometimes emanated from the silver cub. The glow intensified, becoming brighter and brighter until Ethan had to shield his eyes. When he could look again, the old bear's body was gone, replaced by a scattering of what looked like stardust, silvery particles that swirled up into the air and dispersed into the night sky. Where the bear had lain, new flowers immediately began to grow. Impossible flowers that glowed faintly in the darkness, their petals arranged in patterns that matched the constellations above. The silver cub touched one of these flowers with its nose and made a sound that was both mournful and joyful, a recognition that death and birth were part of the same cosmic dance, that endings were also beginnings, that nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed. The gathered animals began to disperse, but each one paused to touch one of the new flowers, as if taking a blessing or leaving a farewell. The parent bears nuzzled their cub, who had grown visibly during the ceremony, not just in size but in presence, as if inheriting something from the departed elder. The star map on the ground had changed too, new patterns emerging where the star dust had settled, creating connections between constellations that hadn't been there before. Ethan realized he was crying again, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of awe, of gratitude for being allowed to witness this intersection of life and death, Earth and cosmos, the mundane and the miraculous. He thought of his wife's death, how it had seemed like only an ending, only loss. But watching the elderly bear transform into stardust and flowers, watching the silver cub sing it into whatever came next, he began to understand that death might be just another kind of birth, another transformation in an endless cycle of becoming. As the night deepened and the clearing emptied of visitors, the silver cub did something new. It walked to the edge of the star map and began to add its own decorations, using its small paws to arrange stones and flowers in patterns that were somehow more complex than anything the adult bears had created. The patterns seemed to move even while staying still, creating optical illusions that made Ethan's eyes water to follow. They were patterns that suggested dimensions beyond the three that humans knew, geometries that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. The cub worked through the night, its parents watching but not interfering, and by dawn, the star map had evolved into something that defied description. It was still recognizable as a representation of the night sky, but it was also something more. A map not just of stars, but of the connections between them. The invisible threads that linked every point of light to every other. The web of existence that included bears and humans and stars, and the spaces between them. As the sun rose, its light hit the expanded crystal formation that had somehow grown from the single piece of quartz, and the entire clearing exploded with rainbows. But these weren't ordinary rainbows. They contained colors that Ethan had never seen before, colors that shouldn't exist in the visible spectrum but somehow did when filtered through these impossible crystals. The silver cub sat in the center of this light show, its fur reflecting and refracting the colors until it seemed to be made of living rainbow. It was then that Ethan understood the final piece of the puzzle, the answer to why he had been allowed to witness all of this. The silver cub turned and looked directly at him, its blue eyes holding knowledge that no weak-old creature should possess. It made a series of musical sounds that Ethan somehow understood were meant for him, a message that bypassed language and spoke directly to his consciousness. The message was simple and profound. You are here to remember. You are here to tell the story. You are here to remind your kind that the universe is alive and aware and full of wonders that wait just beyond the edge of what you think you know. The cub held his gaze for a long moment more, then turned back to its parents, who were preparing to move deeper into the forest. The star map would remain, Ethan understood, growing and changing with the seasons, tended by the bears who knew its purpose. Other silver cubs would be born in other forests. Other witnesses would be chosen. Other stories would be told. The bridge between Earth and stars was not singular but multiple, not rare but hidden. Not impossible, but simply unobserved by those who had forgotten how to see. As the bear family disappeared into the forest depths, the silver cub looked back one last time. It made a single musical note that hung in the air long after the cub had vanished, a note that seemed to say both goodbye and until we meet again. Ethan stood in the clearing surrounded by the impossible star map, the glowing flowers, the crystal formations that shouldn't exist, and he knew his life had been forever changed. He would return to his cabin and write the story, not as a scientific report but as a testament to wonder. Some would think him mad, others would dismiss it as fiction, but somewhere, someone would read it and remember their own encounter with the impossible, their own glimpse of the miraculous that hides in plain sight. The story would be a seed planted in consciousness. waiting for the right moment to grow into understanding that the universe was far more magical than humanity had allowed itself to believe. The star map remained for 3 more weeks before a storm finally scattered its components. But by then, Ethan had documented every detail, photographed every pattern, memorized every impossible angle and cosmic connection. More importantly, he had internalized the message of the Silver Cub, the truth that science and magic were not opposites but different ways of seeing the same infinite mystery. He never saw the Silver Cub again, though sometimes, on clear nights when Ursa Major was bright overhead, he thought he could hear musical notes drifting on the wind, a cosmic lullaby that connected Earth to stars. He never published his photographs or his scientific observations. Instead, he wrote stories, each one containing a piece of the truth, each one a breadcrumb on the trail back to wonder. Years later, when Ethan was old and his own time of transformation was approaching, he returned to the clearing one last time. The star map was gone, but the flowers that had grown from the elderly bear's transformation remained, still glowing faintly, still impossible. As he sat among them, feeling his own body beginning its journey toward whatever came next, he heard it again, that musical sound that had started everything. A silver cub emerged from the forest, not the same one, but another, part of the same cosmic lineage. It approached him without fear and touched its nose to his hand. In that touch, Ethan felt the universe acknowledge him, thank him for his witness, for his stories, for keeping the door open between the possible and impossible. The cub sang for him then, a song that made his approaching transformation feel not like an ending but like coming home. When they found Ethan's body days later, he was surrounded by flowers that shouldn't bloom in that season, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a star map. His face was peaceful, smiling, as if he had seen something wonderful just before the end. His notebook was beside him, the final entry a single line, "The bears know the way home." The stories he had written lived on, dismissed by many but treasured by some, especially by those who had seen their own glimpses of the impossible. Children read them and looked at the night sky differently. Scientists read them and occasionally allowed themselves to wonder what might exist beyond their instruments' ability to detect. And somewhere in forests around the world, silver cubs were being born, bridges between Earth and stars, proof that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than anyone dared to believe. The clearing where it all began eventually became part of a protected wilderness area, though the protection was arranged by people who had no idea what had actually happened there. Hikers occasionally reported strange experiences, glimpses of bears that seemed to glow in moonlight, patterns of stones that looked deliberately arranged, flowers that bloomed out of season. But these reports were dismissed as imagination, as the human tendency to see patterns where none existed. But the patterns did exist. The connections were real. The bridge between Earth and cosmos that the silver cub represented was not unique, but part of an ancient truth that humanity had forgotten in its rush toward rational explanation. The bears remembered. They had always remembered. And through the silver cubs, through the star maps drawn in forest clearings, through the witnesses like Ethan who were chosen to see and remember and tell the story, they were trying to help humanity remember too. The universe was alive. It was aware. It was constantly creating new wonders, new impossibilities, new bridges between what was known and what was beyond knowing. The silver cub had been just one manifestation of this endless creativity, one note in an infinite symphony that played whether humans heard it or not. But for those who did hear it, who did see it, who did allow themselves to believe in the impossible, life became infinitely richer, infinitely more mysterious. infinitely more connected to the cosmic dance that included all things.